I'm sitting down to review Vera Brittain's Testament of Youth. This is a memoir focusing on Brittain's life just before the First World War as a teenager and a young woman, during the war as a VAD, a volunteer nurse, and after the war as she returns to school at Oxford and begins to forge her career as a writer and as a public speaker dealing with international relations, specifically the League of Nations. She published this memoir in 1933, and my specific edition is from 1994, so this book is as old as I am, but my edition also has a preface from 1978, and this is a Penguin edition. The reason I picked this book up is because I did a buddy read with Janelle from the Page Turner. She suggested this book. It's one she wanted to read. I'm glad she did because I enjoyed it. It's a very sad book, but very good to read, very moving, great writing style. In the preface that was published in the 70s, Shirley Williams, who wrote the preface, describes this book as an elegy for a generation. Specifically, she says, Testament of Youth is, I think, the only book about the First World War written by a woman, and indeed a woman whose childhood had been a very sheltered one. It is an autobiography and also an elegy for a generation. That's kind of mirrored in the foreword that Brittain wrote for her own memoir. She says, "It is only in the light of the past that we, the depleted generation now coming into control of public affairs, the generation which has to make the present and endeavor to mold the future, can understand ourselves or hope to be understood by our successors." It is, in a way, a commemoration of the war generation, of the people she lost, of those who survived. She understands that as a member of her generation, as a woman at this time, there's a lot of work for her to do, and you have that tone throughout. When the war broke out, Brittain was barely out of her teenage years. She was a young woman. She was, at the time, attending Oxford. She'd fought very, very hard with her family, with her father, to be allowed to go to Oxford. Her father wasn't going to send her because at this time, most women weren't sent to college. She decided that she wanted to study English. She convinced her family, ended up going to Oxford. Oxford was not the most welcoming place for women at this time. She couldn't even get a degree. She could attend classes, but she couldn't get a degree in the same way that a man could. But when the war breaks out, she leaves school, she leaves Oxford, she leaves the education she fought so very hard to have the chance to get, and becomes a VAD, a volunteer nurse, and ends up serving both domestically and overseas in a number of places. The war is very hard on her. She ends up losing not only her fiancé, but also her brother and another man that she intends to marry, a man who was injured in the war, a dear friend of hers that she had decided that she would marry him to take care of him now that her fiancé was gone. She loses him as well, and when the war is over, she feels very isolated, very forgotten. As a woman, as a nurse, she's not recognized as a veteran. She returns to school, tries to pick up in her studies where she left off. She's obviously a lot older now. She switches her major from English to history, ends up studying public relations, international relations, takes an interest in the League of Nations. Her study of history is very much a study of political science, and she becomes very concerned with lecturing on international affairs and with the fate of Europe, more or less. I think this is meant to be an inspirational work. She's very much trying to inspire the other women of her generation, to prove herself, to tell her story. Not only has she made herself financially independent, not only has she gained a degree from Oxford, but she's also at a very young age become a public speaker, started to play a role, even if a very minor one, in politics. This is a woman who was brought up in a privileged class. She was never meant to get an education as she got. She was never meant to live an independent life. She came from a society where it was intended that she would marry young and become a woman of leisure. Instead, here she is at the end of the war, supporting herself through writing and through lectures. I think it's also meant a sort of elegy, as the preface said. She's recognizing her own role in the war as a nurse, the important role that she played, but also the role that other nurses played. There's one chapter in particular at the end of the war where she described what it felt like to go back to everyday life, to go back to civilian life after the war, and she felt as if she wasn't appreciated for what she had done. She wasn't recognized as a veteran. It seemed as though people wanted her to forget about her experiences, move on from the experiences, and go back to being what she was before. But to her, it was a great sacrifice, and it was, and she was not the same. And through this memoir, she recognizes that her generation was changed. The women of her generation were changed. In the last chapter, where is it at? She recognizes this change. For me and my contemporaries, our old enemies, the Victorian tradition of womanhood, a carefully trained, conscious, a sheltered youth, an imperfect education, lost time, blasted years, were still there and always would be. We seem to be forever slaying them, and they to be forever rising again. In one sense, I was my war was I. Without it, I should do nothing and be nothing. To identify with Brittain all the way through. Early on, Janelle and I discussed this. As a young woman, she is riding a train alone. She gets harassed by a man who sits down next to her when she is alone in a train car. She feels unsafe. Both Janelle and I have had similar experiences on public transit, and although this was written in the 1930s, she seems very much a modern woman. Reading, I identified with her hunger for education, her hunger for a career, her desire to be independent. And I guess what I would say about this memoir is that Vera Brittain portrays herself as not only a strong woman, but a woman who survived a lot and a woman who is perhaps to be admired.